Thank you, Dr. Terry Dwyer. I now ask Professor Peter Coleman to talk about the health issues related to recycling sewage into a drinkable water supply.
Well, thank you very much for all being here tonight. I know it's cold and miserable winter night, and a lot of you would, or most of you would have better places to be, but I think this is an important issue, and I thank the invitation to come. Why am I, as an infectious diseases physician microbiologist, if you like, so worried about this proposal? Well, the reason is that we have had major advances in health over the last 150 years. And while practicing doctors like me get a lot of credit for giving antibiotics and I guess making a difference to individuals, there's two things that I think have mainly contributed to that. And that is immunisation and protecting people from getting infections. But the other major advance has been protecting and improving our water. And that's been through things like chlorination, filtration, etc. But the other major advance is to protect the catchment area. And 100 years ago, or about 150 years ago, there was a disease called colonial fever in Australia that killed lots of people. And that was Salmonella typhi that was mainly distributed through the water supply, and because the water supply was contaminated by human faeces. And animals are obviously a problem as well for other things. Now, it's not greatly surprising if you actually think of human sewage as having lots of germs. I mean, there's viruses in there, there's bacteria in there, and there's protozoa in there. And they have caused lots of diseases. And in fact, in developing countries, still kill lots of people and cause lots of disease. And the last thing we should do is reverse what has been good public health practice for about 150 years. And that's what this proposal is. Now, that's not saying we should not recycle water and use it wisely and economically. But my view is that if you want to put sewage back into your water supply, that should be a last resort option. Not like the ACTUBE proposal, where it is the first option on the table. They've got two proposals on the table. Recycle water from sewage into our drinking water and build a bigger collar dam. At the very least, they should reverse those two proposals. Now, why do I also think this is a problem? Now, I might say with the technology we've got, yes, you can actually improve water and make it reasonably safe, but it's very costly and it's got a risk associated with it. Now, if we lived in some very poor water resource area, such as some areas in southwest Africa, for instance, I would actually say, well, we probably don't have a choice and we have to look at something like this, although my own view is we need to do it safer than the way it's proposed. But that is not the case in Canberra. I mean, when you've heard the figures from Terry, we in a normal year, into our current dams, get 210 gigalitres, which is a billion litres of water. We only use out of those dams, without any restrictions at all, about 65 gigalitres. And we put 30 of that back into the river anyway. With drought and level 2 restrictions, we use about 50 gigalitres. Now, this proposal they've got put up, it firstly is going to recycle 9 gigalitres and eventually 20 gigalitres. Now, if we're only using 50 gigalitres, that means we're going to put 20 gigalitres back into our drinking water, which is 40% of our drinking water. There is no other place on earth that does that, despite what they say. Nobody has that big percentage of their drinking water recycled from sewage. So this is completely a new proposal, in my view, untested anywhere, and I'll talk about that later. Now, what about the system itself? Well, again, if they do the system that's proposed, which includes filtering through very fine membranes and a process called reverse osmosis, it should be very good, at least in theory, in that the arguments are we'll end up with water that's purer than any other water. Now, the only trouble with that is it's twofold. First of all, I think the hype that's given to it doesn't quite seem to stand up when you look at some of the people that have used something like this before. When I tried to find data on this, it's very difficult to get it from ACTUBE. You've got to go to other sources. I looked at what was done in the US, and much to my surprise, in Colorado river water, they commented that it removed 98 to 99% of salts. Now that sounds pretty good, and for most things it is pretty good. But the argument was that it removed 100% of salts. So my argument was, well, why did 1 or 2% not go through? And that's because of issues with salt size and membranes. The other thing is, they're supposed to remove all drugs. Now, drugs are a problem. I'm mainly focused on infections. But drugs such as estrogens are a problem. And what I found also very surprisingly recently, there was a paper just published from a Queensland group that looked at how good the membrane was at removing drugs in the form of antibiotics. They found that only 92% of the antibiotics were removed by the process. Now again, I find that worrying because this is a process that in theory is supposed to remove 100%. Yet there are numerous examples where it doesn't. And nitrates, for instance, in the environmental report that was put out recently in the ACT, pointed out it may only remove 50% of nitrates. Now, admittedly, they're very small molecules, much smaller than viruses. But the trouble is, when you try and find data how good this is at removing viruses, which only the reverse osmosis would do, you can't find good data from in-use systems that show that it works continually over a year or two or three, the life of these membranes. And if it's not performing as touted for salts and drugs, one wonders, how can we really be sure it's going to work for these microbes, particularly when such a big percentage is going to go back into our drinking water? Now that doesn't mean it won't cope, but I do wonder about it. But even if it works according to plan, the real worry is, what happens when things go wrong? Now, there are numerous outbreaks of waterborne disease in Europe, US, Canada, England, that have occurred despite having modern systems in place. In fact, in Milwaukee about 10 years ago, 400,000 people got sick with a protozoan called cryptosporidiosis. Recently, somebody turned the dial the wrong way and caustic soda was accidentally put in the water and a whole lot of burns. Now, those things can happen here now. It's completely okay to say that. But what they're proposing is an added risk to those risks that are there anyway. Now again, if we do not have any other water, I think, well, we will have to put up with this and we'll just have to make it as safe as possible, and I'll talk about some other ways we should do that if it is going to happen. But my fundamental belief is we should not put a population at risk if we don't have to. And also my view is, yes, we should recycle water, but we should do what they do in Singapore and just about every other place. You use it for every purpose other than drinking water. You use it for industry, to feed your computer chip space. You do what they do in Port Kembla. You take the water and you use it for BlueScope steel to use in their steel plant, so they don't take drinking water out of the dam. We still fill Lake Burley Griffin up with drinking water. We let water out of our dam upstream to keep it filled, basically. Now, there are other waters that go in there as well, but that strikes me as, we don't have big industry in Canberra, but we do have needs for irrigation, watering Parliament House, keeping our lakes filled. Why don't we recycle water and use it for that purpose and keep these potential pathogens out of our water supply if it happens that something should go wrong? Now, one of the other things that annoys me, I guess, is the way this material comes out. This is put up, this is a completely safe process that's used in numerous places around the world. You don't have to worry. I think that's misleading. For starters, if you look at the Australian Drinking Water Guidelines, at least how I read them and how other people have read them, this is a high-risk proposal. Now, I fully acknowledge that if you've got all the bells and whistles and it all works, it will be rare or seldom that something will go wrong. However, if something does go wrong and this water is distributed to 300,000–400,000 people, the consequences of that are fairly disastrous. And that's why it's called a high-risk proposal. It will rarely go wrong, but if it does, the consequences are fairly significant. And therefore it's a high-risk proposal. Those words are never used in either Brisbane or here, where this proposal was put up. And that's what the Australian Drinking Water Guidelines say. So this is a high-risk proposal. Now again, that doesn't mean you never take it. If you do not have any other water or any other choice, you will have to do this. I firmly believe, however, we have lots of other choices in Canberra.